I'm Oscar, and this is The Mirror in My Cell, a conversation series on the strength, truth, and humanity known through incarceration. My normalish life was interrupted when some stowaway cannabis of mine reappeared at a Belarusian border checkpoint. The charge would be for 3 to 7 years. I was forced to witness myself and understand the power I do have. It changed me in how I saw my life. Now I want to meet the others who've been changed by incarceration. In this episode, I speak to Simon Bright, a Zimbabwean filmmaker who was arrested by Robert Mugabe's regime in 2004. Born in the colonial African nation of Rhodesia, Simon was at one point a staunch supporter of Robert Mugabe's, but eventually he became one of his victims, as Mugabe sought, increasingly ruthlessly, to preserve power and control the Zimbabwean people. Because of Simon's journalistic work and connections, he was arrested and remained in jail for a short but emotionally significant time. Simon now lives in the United Kingdom and continues to produce excellent films, especially those recounting the troubled history of Africa. Unlike mine, Simon's arrest was decades in the making, so I found it really interesting how he integrated his experience into his broader philosophy and motivations, especially regarding the topics of race and equality. I really hope you enjoy the conversation. Hi, Simon.
Hello.
It's really nice to speak to you today. We've been having conversations for a while now about how we can get together and talk about things. As soon as my mum explained to me about what had happened to you, it felt like there would be lots of overlap that would make sense for us to talk through together. So I think the first thing to explain a little bit is what it was that put you in a position to end up in prison in Zimbabwe. And that story starts a long time before you arrived in prison. Would you mind giving a brief outline of your background and childhood and how that overlapped with the wider story of Zimbabwe?
Yeah, sure. It'd be interesting to discuss these things with you. I grew up in Rhodesia when there was effectively a version of apartheid. Ian Smith had declared unilaterally independence from Britain. And had locked up the black political opposition. And a slight irony of my story is that my parents were against the white supremacy of Ian Smith. I left Rhodesia in order to avoid being conscripted into the military to fight the black liberation armies, Mugabe and Nkomo. And I went to England and did my studies and worked for a while as a youth worker in the United Kingdom. And then when Zimbabwe became independent, I went back in 1982, along with many other Zimbabweans, and worked in the Ministry of Agriculture, met my wife, who was a filmmaker from the United Kingdom, who was visiting her brother in Zimbabwe, and we set up a film company called Zim Media, which was very successful. We started making anti-apartheid documentaries. Towards the year 2000, Mugabe was faced with a significant black opposition from the trade union movement, and he almost lost his first election in the 2002 elections, and this gave him quite a shock. So he called out the race card, and that's when the farm invasions began, if you remember those. But at the same time, he had a very narrow definition of what constituted a good Zimbabwean. And basically, a good Zimbabwean was somebody who had fought with him in his section of the two-army guerrilla struggle that liberated Zimbabwe and was from his part of the world, a Zezuru Mashona. Anybody who opposed him, black or white, was a tool of the Americans and the British. So that was the kind of general political context which led to my arrest. My wife had made a film called Give Us Peace, Zimbabwe 2003, which was a story about a dancer going through riots to get to a dance class where he performed. He was the lead performer, and as he arrived, the choreographer said to him, "You're late." And he gave a simple explanation: there was trouble in town. We showed that trouble, And the trouble involved people being shot during the Breda riots. It was archive footage that we used. And then he did a dance of power with a young girl. And the metaphor was one of peaceful power in contrast to the violent power that we'd seen in the beginning of the film. We didn't have permission to make this film, and we had to leave the country shortly thereafter, without going into all of the details. I came back in 2004 to finish films which we still had on the books. And I was making a very innocuous film about the Limpopo Transnational Frontier Park. So it wasn't a politically contentious film at all. The week I was due to leave, a friend of mine had helped the Panorama UK BBC programme to make an expose of the youth militias that Mugabe was using to intimidate his opposition in the countryside. We called them the Green Bombers because they had green uniforms. They were unemployed youth, taught violence and indoctrinated politically. They were a bit like Nazi brown shirts, effectively. And the Zimbabwean authorities were infuriated by this expose. They were looking for a fall guy. I didn't think it would be me because I wasn't used to working stringing for overseas companies like BBC. I was reasonably relaxed. But on the last day, as I was cycling around, picking up my last-minute presents, I received a phone call on my mobile saying, "This is Police Central, report to us immediately." And I thought, oh no, that's me. I'm the one. So I cycled back as fast as I could to my office, pick up my passport and think about what I could do next to get out of the country. And as I came in, I found the police van loading our entire video collection, 20 years of videotapes and films, into the back of a pickup. The police looked up and saw me, but they couldn't believe that this most dangerous producer in Zimbabwe would be riding a bicycle. And I was able to cycle out without being stopped, where I met my lawyer, and we agreed this plan that they would go back later after the police had left and see if they could get my passport if it hadn't been taken, and I would go to the airport later that night and fly out. They went back. The police had left my suitcase behind with its passport. And so I picked it up and drove to the airport to catch my flight back to London. I just got myself upgraded to business class.
Nice.
And when I was jumped by two CIO guys, they typically wear suits, and got forcibly bundled into one of the side doors leading from those tubes that take you out towards the plane. And that led me straight into a Zimbabwean holding cell at the airport. So those were the circumstances of my arrest.
That arrest was the culmination of many years of changing circumstances and the rise of a authoritarian state.
Yes, yeah. When Mugabe came into power, he declared reconciliation, much like Mandela did.
And you supported him at the beginning.
I was a total supporter because him coming to power meant that I could go back home because I was no longer eligible for Rhodesia. He enabled me to come home. And we were all very enthusiastic about rebuilding the new Zimbabwe. And there was a lot of hope. There was a lot of success. The illiteracy level went from 70% illiteracy to 40% illiteracy in a period of 4 years at that time. Small farmer, peasant agriculture, increase in maize was like 1,400% in that time. Of course, it was going from almost zero during the war, but nevertheless impressive in the Ministry of Agriculture where I was working, and so on. So it was quite successful, the new Zimbabwe. But then Mugabe, the 90s came, and the International Monetary Fund had this procedure where they insisted on countries balancing their books and cut back on education and all the social investment that had been made. And this brought stress to the country. Mugabe always had a tendency to want to be the total absolute power. So you can't blame that on the IMF. But the stresses in the country meant that he lost support as people lost their free education and the health care declined and the country went into a recession, really, inflation. And his own comrades held a knife to his throat because they felt that they had not been adequately rewarded for their sacrifices during the liberation struggle. So to placate them, he gave them land in return for votes. That's why the land invasions happened. So that's the kind of context of geopolitics and the personality of a man, Robert Mugabe, leading to a dictatorship effectively, which was the political environment that led to my arrest.
And were you always aware of the effects, economics, geopolitics, communism, capitalism, and the ambitions of a dictator had on your life personally? Was that always something that you felt?
You know, if you grow up in Rhodesia and you don't believe in the history or the cultural norms or the politics, because my family were against that form of racism and racialized versions of history, you have to work out an understanding of the world, a different understanding of the world. Most people are educated into that understanding of the world. But we had to uneducate ourselves and reconfigure the world in a way that made sense to us. And so as a result of that, I think I've always had a tendency to look at history very critically, not take what people say as given. We were used to a lot of propaganda in the Rhodesian days, and then later, of course, Mugabe used exactly the same tactics as the Rhodesians did in terms of media control and propaganda. And so my life had been spent trying to penetrate the fog of misinformation which states habitually put out, including what we get from the BBC here.
Good old Blighty. And was that then, that must have been challenging to deconstruct one lens in place of another, and then need to deconstruct that new one that you built for yourself?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it was tricky, that movement away from being a supporter to understanding the nuance of what was actually going on in the country. I'd already was highly critical of Mugabe, but I think it was only later when I made my film, Robert Mugabe, What Happened, that was a process of helping me to fully comprehend or put a meaning to the events that I'd lived through and try and understand the man himself by interviewing some of his closest colleagues. And that was all a way of reconciling myself to the history that I lived through.
And that history came to a crux with that arrest, which you just described. What happened?
Well, the first night passed pleasantly enough because the airport police were just, all they had to do was hold me. And there was a comical moment when they didn't have breakfast facilities, so they had to marched me to the airport canteen, handcuffed to a policeman. And I'd sit there and eat. I paid for my own breakfast and eat it with the policeman chained up to him while people were sitting around in the airport cafe watching the spectacle. But I knew that I should enjoy myself while that lasted, because it was probably going to get very much worse. So I immediately moved into this kind of live in the moment, because you can either, you're actually quite comfortable in a nice clean cell with loads of blankets, got a book to read, you've got access to your phone. And if you allow your mind to be taken over by possibility of torture, long-term incarceration, you don't know what might happen, because you must understand that these kinds of things had been happening to other people who had opposed Mugabe. I knew the son of some other friend of mine who had been taken in and had electrodes applied to his testicles as part of the interrogation tactic. So I knew that in detail. I had the material to allow my mind to become totally clouded, and I wouldn't have enjoyed that day that I spent in the comfortable police cells in the airport. Of course, you still have it impinging on you. You can't quite bat away those thoughts. But then I got taken into Police Central, stuck in a cell with 26 people. A cell was designed for 6 people.
Wow.
Standing room only. To get to the toilet, you had to put on, if you get hold of plastic bags, you had to wade through all the excrement that stood between you and the toilet seat. It was, not comfortable in that cell.
So it sounds like there was both a lot of stimulation, but at the same time, a lot of emptiness and time to think the way that you wanted to think.
My brain was working overtime on how to survive this process, So the stimulus was there. And a lot of time to think things. It was during this period that I came up with, asked myself the question, Robert Mugabe, what happened? What happened to the man that I supported? Why did you fight to free your country and then destroy it? What are the kind of different factors that work on a man's personality as well as his own personality, which give rise to your actions? And that actually became the title of a film that I started making 5 years later, called Robert Mugabe, What Happened? So that was where the reflective process started. Yes, definitely.
And was it something about you or the situation or the surroundings that you were able to think some of the most important thoughts you ever thought there?
It gave me the stimulus, but not the answers. It took, in a sense, it caused a triggering process of thought, which led me into a series of actions, which ended up with the making of the film. I'll put it like that. I didn't sit in prison and dream all the answers that I believe I have now, or understandings. So it's a trigger.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what it does to you.
And did you recognize it for that in the moment as well? Did you know it was something important was happening inside of you, or was it on reflection you realized that's what it had been?
No, I knew that something important was happening to me at the time.
Mm-hmm.
That I had to. It's etched pretty clearly in my mind. I was there for a much shorter time than you. Maybe the external and real threats to my body and mind were more violent. I don't know. I imagine also that a long time also becomes very eroding. I don't really know how people survive a long time, and the present can prison conditions. But so I had a short, intense period.
Because I think that is, on reflection, that's something quite unique about the experience, especially if you're able to see it immediately for a significant event. There's probably not that many moments in our lives where you can say without a doubt, I'm living through right now one of the most significant moments of my life. I think that I wouldn't be able personally to point to another chapter of my life that I knew in the moment would hold as much long-term significance. And I think getting into that mindset, or being able to immediately recognize how you behave, how you think, what you do with yourself, is a very powerful experience. It becomes very obvious that how I live now is the important bit. It's not making plans for later, or it's not what are my ambitions that one day I might achieve. It's you are living an incredibly significant chapter of your life right now.
You are younger than me, and I've been lucky or blessed to live through many quite intense experiences. So this was like a turning point rather than totally seminal.
Yeah.
That's what I would say.
Yeah.
I lived through the glory of those wonderful initial development years when I had a 4x4 truck and a Nagra tape recorder and a camera, and I'd go around making radio programs and making training films for the Ministry of Agriculture all over the country. That was just, and everybody was optimistic. So that was wonderful. And this was like the other end of that process. Necessary for me to understand the transition that had happened in the country. But I still remain astonished by the optimism and hope that keeps Zimbabweans going somehow through the worst of circumstances. But yeah, when I was in prison, my main thought was I do not want to be tortured into giving away any of my fellow filmmakers. I just thought I cannot live with myself but you don't know, you don't know how you're going to react under torture if it comes to that. But I just had this total determination. You can betray somebody in exchange for your liberty. Undoubtedly, I would have thought. So I refused that option. But then the next morning, I was taken off on a mobile interrogation by the Law and Order Department. That was the unit that arrested me. And they had some of my videotapes in the back of the car. And it was actually a standard tactic of theirs. They'd fill up the car with people who would be hurling racial abuse at you, demeaning you, just trying to make you undermine your morale as far as possible, to erode any sense of pride or self. I absolutely was determined not to implicate any of my fellow filmmakers. And then at the end of that kind of round circle out into the dusty roads outside Harare, they said, "We're not collaborating. We're going to have to hand you over to the Central Intelligence Organization for proper interrogation." And I think you know what that means. And we'll go there now. And at that point, the head of Law and Order received a phone call. And we turned back. I went back to the prison. And I later discovered from my lawyer that she had made that phone call and she had got a high court judge to issue an order of habeas corpus because they hadn't charged me for anything.
And you spoke a little bit earlier about the optimism that some people still had for Zimbabwe. How did going to prison change how you thought about the state of the country?
A couple of things about going to prison. The fear of being imprisoned was actually, it was a relief when I was there. In other words, once you're imprisoned, your mind is capable of building up and causing you more pain with the anticipation of terror than the terror as far as I experienced it. But as I say, I was lucky and I got off lightly. That was one of the experiences, was a sense of relief that you're still alive, you're still okay, you're still surviving, you haven't betrayed anybody, haven't betrayed your principles. And it made me much more determined in a way, much more, it stiffened my resolve in a number of ways.
Did you learn something about, is that what?
That's what I learned, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Is that I had the capacity, the resolve to protect my principles, which is not betray people, and to not fall apart in the face of intimidation and terror. And I think that's a lesson which, as we speak, I realize that I'm now drawing on, because I'm now 72 years old. And when I think about what I want to do with the rest of my life, I just think I'm pretty clear about the kind of things that I think I need to do, kind of things that I'm interested in. And I'm going to try not to waste too much time. I think when you're in prison, there's a sudden shocking realization about how sweet is liberty, how sweet freedom is. If you haven't been imprisoned, I think it's very difficult to understand how lucky we are.
Mm.
And in a sense, we cloud and we waste our freedoms in a way.
So how have you managed to keep that appreciation going since your present experience? Is this something you have to work at to maintain that attitude?
I did it partly in the way that you're doing this now, to try and process your experience by comparing with other people. I did it to answer the big question, what had happened to my country, Zimbabwe, and what was driving the man who was leading it. And then, having been to prison once, made me bolder about doing what I then did, which was to cross over one of the more porous border points and smuggle myself into the country and begin undercover to make this film. That all required a lot of resolve, determination, and also managing fear. You could say conquering fear, but it's not, you don't really conquer fear. You manage fear. It impinges on you. I don't know how you found fear, but
I do remember leaving and feeling like this is, like, it's not the time to back down in who I am. I did feel like it was the kind of thing that I wanted to push me towards acting with more conviction rather than less conviction. So I think that sounds similar. It's really interesting. The experience both kind of empowered you as a filmmaker and you processed the experience as a filmmaker. Did you also, in a way, experience it as a filmmaker? Because I guess there must be something about understanding how other people are likely to see a situation, recognizing the story and the characters and the narrative of a situation. Was that happening for you in the moment? Do you think there was a way that you experienced it in a way that someone who wasn't a filmmaker or a commentator might? That was a long question, sorry.
I think my mind went into overdrive tactically. I was obviously aware of how my story would be represented outside by my supporters, by my wife and my fellow African filmmaker friends and the whole network of people who did exert pressure to get me out. Have I ever thought about making a film about the experience? I don't think I have, but it's engraved, and maybe this interview will prompt me to write it down more fully than I have done so far as an experience.
You touched on something which I would probably be one of the first topics most people jump to when they think about Zimbabwe, race. And obviously you'd spent a lot of your life thinking about race. Did those thoughts continue in the same vein when you were in prison? Or did you feel like you got new insight on the topic of race and your existing ideas about racism?
I was the only white guy in the prison, but that didn't seem to have any impact on my fellow prisoners. I felt without race within the prison environment. Of course, my interrogators were using race because that was the political climate of the time. And since then, I've thought quite a lot about race, because what I've realized is that we were fighting, me and my parents were struggling for a multiracial society, a society where race doesn't matter. But now we're in the 21st century where it seems like race matters more than ever. It's become such a burning issue. What I realized was that, and this is a realization that grew over time, was triggered in the police cell or before, maybe, was that what I value is not just distinctions based on race, hierarchies based on race, because you can have an inverted hierarchy of race. I experienced at that time a racial abuse by black policemen, and I was being targeted because I was a white. I would have been targeted as a black filmmaker doing the same thing, but the invective that was coming my way was my whiteness. And having experienced black discrimination, black racism, made me think about racism. It made me think that apartheid is a separate state. So the wisdom that my mother gave me came from her conversations with a man called Robert Mugabe, who was the first nationalist leader of Zimbabwe. And Herbert Mugabe, at a cocktail party with Joan Bright, my mother, said, "What you have to understand, Mrs. Bright, is that blacks are not worse than the whites. They're not better than the whites. They're just as bad as the whites."
Mm.
And I guess that was ringing through my head when I was in prison.
Mm.
Because it was the same legislation the Rhodesians had used against the black nationalists in the 1960s that was then used against me in the early 2000s.
Mm-hmm. And how do you feel talking about race today, especially having gone through the experiences that you had in Zimbabwe? Is it difficult for you? I know that lots of white people find it very challenging and are hesitant to claim to have an understanding of the intimate dynamics of race or oppression.
I don't really find it difficult to talk about race because, as you said, I have been thinking about race my whole life. Grew up in a racially segregated school. I was very happy that my children in Zimbabwe went to a non-racially segregated school. It was like 40 black kids, 2 white kids. And I tried to make sure that they learned, and they did learn, speak Shona in a way which sadly I have never done, but they are fluent in it. You're right, I've thought about race. It's quite complex. I think about race and I think about power. Racial supremacy confers a power on the dominant group that's controlling, even if it's a minority group, as in South Africa or Rhodesia. And power unchecked is always very dangerous. It always, I think, corrupts unless you're checked by your fellow human beings. I believe in a kind of South African indigenous philosophy called Ubuntu, which means I am because we are. I think we're a function of our social context. Don't have to be locked into it. Just because I grew up as a white, I don't have to be a white supremacist. But nevertheless, human beings are held in check by each other. And if you have an equal relationship where people can check each other, which I suppose is the principle of democracy, really, then power is checked. We can have different skin colors. We can have different belief systems. There'll always be something fascinating in the way that a different person to you thinks and interprets in the world. But for some reason, for so many people, difference is frightening.
Mm.
And I don't understand. I've always grown up with difference. And of course, demagogues, repressive political movements want people to conform to the particular vision, and it's useful for political power, to retain political power, and that's what dictators do, whether Mussolini or Hitler or all the other ones that have followed in their footsteps. They don't like difference. And as far as I've experienced, as I say, I've been the victim of black extreme racial invective and discrimination at the hands of the Zimbabwean security. But that doesn't in any way change my love or affection for the country or for the people of Zimbabwe or for African people. I support a primary school in my home village with funds that I raise here, and then I partner with them, and then they use it to build classrooms, provide running water. I don't feel like I'm a white savior in that situation. I feel like I'm retaining a connection to my home territory and giving me the privilege of being able to walk around the beautiful hills that I was brought up in, on the farms that we once owned, which are now run by black small farmers because that land was redistributed to small black farmers. I don't have a problem with that. I think there's total justice in that. So what I'm saying is that racial discrimination, whether it's white or black or Jewish or whatever form it takes, is a political construct used for the advantage of the person who's pushing that line. And I just don't think it's the way forward for the human race. I think and my experiences in prison helped. That vision has been shaping itself all through my life. But the prison experience was an important step in the process of those kinds of recognitions.
So when you actually got arrested, you had already left Zimbabwe, right?
Yeah.
Did you question yourself about the steps you were taking as you removed yourself from that situation? I mean, for me, I'm looking back on Belarus and feeling like I was suddenly made aware of a struggle of a whole nation and connected on a intimate personal level with people that I cared deeply about. I'm somehow confused about how I integrate what I witnessed and what I felt about what I was witnessing into how I plan the next steps of my life, what I make the rest of my life about in some ways. You made a film about Zimbabwe afterwards? Was it, I'm just wondering how you made the decisions about how you moved forward in your life, having been party to what you were party to, but equally having the possibility to extract yourself.
When we fled Zimbabwe in 2003, which was the year before my arrest, or 6 months before my arrest, when I went back, I was so relieved to get the family out and get ourselves into a safe space and get ourselves into a space where we weren't ruled by paranoia. It was wonderful. It was like an epiphany. It was like, actually, it was about like being released from prison in a way. Because it's the mental constructs that are the worst part of these processes.
Yeah.
It's what your mind does to you. But then we thought we'd just be a couple of years and we'd be going back. We didn't think we would spend the rest of our lives in England. Now I accept that I will probably die in England. Later, the sense of loss, dislocation, the sense of deep hurt because of being wrenched away, being driven out of my country, began to sink in. And then I was looking for links and ways to keep the connection going. And so I was even willing to go to the lengths of doing an undercover film, even though I'd been arrested once before, just because I felt outraged that I should be thrown out from the place where I expected to. I'd contributed and I expect to continue to. My whole cultural reference was African. I always felt myself, still feel myself to be totally African. Yeah.
And that film that you made is a very beautiful film, Robert Mugabe, What Happened, which I would encourage everyone to watch. Was that a part of your healing, a part of your processing, making that film?
Yes, definitely. Yeah. The government had been using some of the early anti-apartheid films, and the feature film Ingrid made, Flame, as part of the on CBC, has been used by ZANU in the 2000s. While arresting me, they were using my footage on TV as part of their propaganda efforts. And I just was completely outraged by that. I had to redress that by making a film which told the story in as complex a way as I could by interviewing colleagues, guys who had been at school with Mugabe, guys who had fought in the struggle with him, people who had been in cabinet with him, and all of whom had now a critical perspective on Mugabe. Also, there was something tactical in that, in the sense that the British media was treating Mugabe as another stupid black dictator, and he was very clever. And the more he got pilloried by the West, the more popular he became in Africa as the man who stood out against imperialism. So that helped. He turned it against it. He used the force of the West against itself. And I was aware that was what he was doing. And so I needed to have a film that where his colleagues, and because color does count, even though it's a symbolic construct, I had a lot of his black colleagues criticizing him, because then it wouldn't be written off as just a white. So you begin to play with racial mixes, and in the same way as Mugabe's playing with them. They're tools in systems of meaning, communication, politics.
Thanks so much for talking so candidly about, it wasn't at all just some time that you spent in prison. It was a whole life that you let us have an insight into there. So thank you very much. And I think it's, very nice to speak about it.
Thank you. And it's great to be given an opportunity to be interrogated, to be asked questions, because it forces you to relive and rethink those moments. So thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'm Thomas.